welcome everybody to our ongoing series, Don't Put Off Dying Until You're Dead. Reminder of where we are with things. We still have our Lenten opportunities going on. You know, if you haven't done anything for Lent, you never did get around to doing it, it's not too late even yet. You can still do something. And so I remind you, we have Thursdays at Trinity. I actually think we might have one copy of the book left again. So if you want one, you can even buy a copy of the book. If you want to come just for the first parts and listen in during the book discussion part, it might still be of interest to you, even if you don't have the book. So that's Thursdays. Lent Madness continues. We're into the round of the Saintly 16. And we'll say more about where we are in maybe next week, maybe not. And then Episcopal Relief and Development, that still goes on. The Lenten devotionals, I think there's probably still one or two of those floating around. And I know the boxes are there. And I know even if you never get around to a box, if you just want to write a check, I'm pretty sure they'll take it. So you can participate in all or any of those as you're inclined to do so. Palm Sunday is suddenly just 2 weeks away. I don't have them in front of me. I should have brought them in. So at 8 o'clock, we'll bless the palms and have the whole service here at Trinity. At the 10:15 service, we'll start over at St. Helens. We'll bless the palms there and then have a little bit of a parade on over. Both that'll be out next week. Our invitations for Holy Week and Easter services will be out next week as well. And we'll say probably just a little bit about that next week. But back to our topic at hand. Don't put off dying until you're dead, and Lent, a season of mortality. There's that C.S. Lewis quote that I put up in front of you. Die before you die. There is no chance after. And I cast around, and there are these two contradictory things I've been kind of scratching my head over a little bit. I think at the end of the day, both are true. Yeah. And if you cannot live with both being true at the same time, I think you're missing out on something near the secret of what it means to live at all. Does that make any sense to you?
Yep. Yes.
So I offer that to you today, just to ponder on your own. That's not really the focus of today. It might tie in more with the focus next week. But while you're alive, live, and don't ever fool yourself that you're going to be immortal. So make sure that you find a way to live comfortably with that reality. Okay. This is where we are today. It's our 4-part series. We've been through the first 3 parts. Today it's funeral planning. Next week, a holy death. And we'll say a little tiny bit about that later today, and it's in our announcements in any event. Very beginning, I just want to pause on this point. Are we talking about funerals or memorials? And the thing of it is, I'm going to use the words this morning interchangeably.
You've done it, right?
So, are we talking about funeral planning, or are we talking about planning for a memorial?
Yes.
And I want to say at the outset, I'm going to use those words a bit interchangeably. I'm going to come back and talk about the distinction a little bit later, but by and large, I'm going to talk about both of those words interchangeably. And here's the thing. Neither word is the one used in the prayer book. The prayer book talks not about a funeral or not about memorial services. The prayer book talks about the burial of the dead. It just puts it out there, which is what we probably ought to be doing ourselves. I tend to be a little gentler when I do the bulletins for service. That's what I think I tend to call it. I don't remember what now. I put something different on the book. I don't use prayer book language for that because it's a little bit too in the face for some people. Yes, ma'am.
By memorial, is that like celebration of life? Is that the same?
Let me come back and talk about that a little bit. In our tradition, no.
Okay.
I think a celebration of life is something different, which is important to note. I am first and foremost a priest of the Episcopal Church, and so when I do a service, this is what I'm doing. I'm not doing a celebration of life. And if I were an officiant, I might be freer to do different things, but I'm not. So there you have it. So we'll come back. We're going to talk about that a little bit, tease it out a little bit as we go through everything we're doing. First of all, I wrote the book on this. On this topic. This is my published book. If you were to go out online and ask Amazon, put my name in on Amazon, you're going to find this book. I have seen it listed for hundreds of dollars.
By who?
I've never seen it sold for hundreds of dollars. It's out of print now, and in a lot of ways it should be because things have changed. Just as really almost a total aside, there was some conversation I know, and I don't know what we're going to do down the road. We may yet put a hymn board up.
Oh my goodness.
I know it's come up, but part of the reason why I'm not sure it's a good idea is because the church has been changing and is going to continue to change. And so the idea of a hymn board worked really well when you had a prayer book and a hymnal, and that's all we used. And you would typically, on a hymn board, you'd put the hymns, and you'd also put the psalm in there, because everybody knew where to find those things. But increasingly, we print things in bulletins, we borrow hymns from different places, and so on and so forth, and those things just don't work as well. I kind of hate closing these, but it makes a lot of sense right now. So, anyhow, in the same way, one size fits all funeral planning service books maybe don't work so well anymore, because we don't necessarily follow things that way. I wrote the book I was inspired, I guess I should say, to write my book. Here's a copy right here. I was inspired to write it because there was a very similar book like this out that I found helpful for talking to couples when they were planning a wedding. And so I think it was called Planning a Wedding in the Episcopal Church or some such thing. And I was telling a friend of mine about this, and I said, I don't know why they don't write one for planning a funeral. And he says, why don't you write it? And I said, well, they already have people who do these kinds of things. Why would they need me to write? So I actually wrote the publisher, and I suggested the idea. I said, first of all, I think you ought to do that. If you aren't doing it, I'm offering that I could do it. And they took me up on it. And they actually bought me a laptop with the pros. My royalties actually paid for my first laptop. It's kind of cool. And I learned a lot about writing books. I learned it's a lot more work than you think. This silly little thing, by the standard of some writing books, this thing took me hours and hours and days and weeks. And I had to take an extra week of vacation to finally hit my deadline to get this silly little thing done. And it isn't rocket science, I got to tell you that. So there you have it. But there was this other wedding book, and there was a need, I thought, for something like it for funerals for a few reasons. There are similarities that strike me whenever I'm talking with either somebody planning a wedding or somebody planning a funeral between the two.
It's been all around.
The similarities are that there are just a lot of details to go through. The similarities are that you need to think through who's going to be the participant for this service. You're not looking at sort of the normal cast of characters. You don't know who your readers and lectors and Eucharistic ministers and acolytes and ushers and all those other people are for this particular service. You're bringing in a lot of strangers. And principally, you're asking people who aren't trained to craft liturgies to craft one of the most important liturgies they'll ever have to work on. So you're having amateurs do something and you're not telling them how to do it. So the wedding book was helpful for that reason. So too, I thought a funeral planning book would be helpful for them as well. The additional urgency for the funeral one was, for weddings, you have typically a lot of time to get ready and talk through all the details. Very commonly for funerals, you have a day or two. And so for all those reasons, I thought this book was needed, and since nobody else did it, I did. It's out of print. And I think things have changed such that it'll never be resurrected. So, but there you have it. Funeral planning. It is a difficult and unwelcome task. A story, an anecdote, a joke. It was a difficult subject to bring before his aged mother, but Bert felt that he must. "Mom," he said, "you're no longer a spring chicken, and you do need to think ahead of what will happen in the future. Why don't we make arrangements about when you pass on?" The mother didn't say anything, just sat there staring ahead. I mean, Mom, how do you want to finally go? Do you want to be buried? Cremated? There was yet another long pause. Then the mother looked up and said, "Son, why don't you surprise me?" Well, here's the thing. We're never, ever ready. It's always a surprise. And I say that, in just about every way of looking at the whole thing. I have on occasion, not very often, but I have on occasion been at a bedside with family members when a loved one breathes their last. And even when everybody in the room knows it's coming, and even when it's been a vigil we've been keeping for days, hours, and minutes, in my experience, when the last breath, it comes as a shock. It's just one of those moments. But what do you make of the attitude of the mother in that story who doesn't want to discuss it? It's, of course, in a way, not helpful. But I think it can be a gift. Because I'm not convinced in the first place that it's helpful to take away from those who are left behind the work they really do need to do. There are decisions they need to make. And if you take it all away from them, you're in some ways, you're helping them, but if you take it away from them, you're not necessarily helping them, if you get what I'm saying here. There's work they need to do. There's stuff they have to go through. And if you just sort of take it all away, they don't have to think about it. They might not do all that they need to do. And her reticence, I think, can serve a point that is worth asking about who the service is for anyhow. There are a lot of people who will say to me after a loved one dies, and I experience this more in Oregon than I did anywhere else. But there are a lot of times when somebody will come to me and they'll say something like, "Mom never wanted a service." And so the family honors her wishes of not having a service. And it ain't for them, or it isn't for her at that point. It's for those who are left behind. And to take away what they need isn't doing them any favors. And so her reticence to speak, it seems to me, in some respects, I think might actually be a helpful reticence. If it leaves the family free to do what the family needs to do. So that's my first observation to make. And my admonition, in whatever else happens today, in our relatively few minutes here today, my admonition is to you, is to think of whatever advanced planning you want to do for your funeral, to think of it as a gift and not make it a burden on your family. It is not helpful in my estimation to make this a promise you exact from them from your deathbed or even from beyond the grave. I mean, that can be a real straitjacket for those who are left to struggle and deal and grieve and all the rest. So think of it as a gift. And gifts, real gifts, once you give them, they don't belong to you anymore. As an aside, when things are given to the church, we don't have to use them forever. That's not fair. There are some gifts that we need to let be retired. Or in the case of the lovely vestments we had this morning, repurposed in a way that we can actually use them. Because what we had before we couldn't use. So Helen, as you will have seen or will see, has done some really lovely things for vestments this morning. Anyhow, gifts, real gifts are given away, and once you give them away, they belong to those to whom you give it. So if you give funeral planning to your family, that belongs to them then. You've let go. Cut the strings, and don't make that too onerous for that. So any reactions to that somewhat uncomfortable proposition for some? I saw a few heads nodding. Any contrary opinions out there? Yes, ma'am.
My husband planned his service down to the nth degree with bagpipes and choirs and a brass quintet. And it was a gift. It was a real gift.
Yeah.
And he worked a long time fitting it into Robert with Bill, but it wasn't.
Okay, yeah. And so I don't want to, in my ranting and railing on the other side, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that it can be a gift. Absolutely. But as I say, the ones that really hurt for me are when I hear someone say, as I said before, Mom never wanted a service. And that just sort of robs the people who need to grieve of one of those things they need to be able to do. Yes?
Something you said earlier reminded me of a completely different situation when I was getting ready to have a house built. Somebody told me, don't try to tell the architect designer person don't do all that for him. Provide a framework, a sense of what you want and why, and then let the other side of that conversation, the architect in this case, bring what they bring. And that seems maybe to be some middle ground here that provides some information and still allow for.
Well, in that case, the architect is the expert. You don't want to
Right.
direct the expert. In the case of a funeral service, the ones who are actually doing it are the experts in what they need.
Exactly.
In a way that you may not be.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My mom didn't believe in funerals, and so she told us that she didn't want a funeral, but she would allow a mass to be said. My sister and I actually put together a funeral inside of that mass. Worked with the priest so that she kind of got her way, but also those of us that needed a funeral got a funeral.
My aunt just passed away last week, very suddenly with no plans. And she was a proper English lady, so I'm going to be gone for Easter because they're having a tea party in the park.
Oh my goodness.
So her plans, she didn't have any, but we got to make them all, and we're having a field day.
Literally.
Funeral planning. Again, following up on this point, and this does come back to the gift side of it. I hit one side harder. Let me give due to some of the reasons why it can be helpful to do some planning. One is to let your family know your wishes. And I'm taking these talking points actually from a website. It's a funeral industry website, so it's a little bit biased, but I repeat them because I think they're also probably helpful for people who have been experiencing families going through this stuff. Their first point, let your family know your wishes. Their observation is, and I've had this observation, I'm sure you all have too, families after a death go into crisis mode. And if a family is solid, it can be really good. And if a family has cracks, it can, when you're in crisis. And if that's the case, to leave your family with some direction about what your wishes are can be really helpful because they don't have to fight about that at a time like that. So if you have arrangements with a funeral home and everybody knows what they are and you don't want to be cremated and everybody knows that you want to be cremated, then your family doesn't have to say, well, I don't think Dad ever wanted to get cremated. You can avoid some of those. So that's a piece of it, and I think it's a good point to make. They also say, in terms of the peace of mind thing, they say that more than 150 decisions and tasks must be completed within the first 24 to 48 hours. And it can give you peace of mind, they say, if you've made those decisions as best you can ahead of time. Again, for the sake of the family left behind. The third point they say, and this is the one I probably am less convinced by it, as I've already indicated, urgent decisions made without stress is how they put it here, but they go on in the narrative and they say, all of your arrangements are guaranteed and will be carried out just as you have directed. Okay?
Sure.
I've already told you a little bit why I'm uncomfortable with that proposition, but, okay, if that's important to you to make those things, it might give you peace of mind now to know you have done that, and you don't have to worry about that later. And finally, for the funeral home industry especially, what's going on over there?
Sorry, you said you don't have to worry about that later, and I just said when you're dead. Hopefully we're
I was
not worried
thinking
about
in the
that.
time between when you make the decision and you die. So that's why your stress while you're still alive goes away.
Oh, I was thinking, okay.
Thank you for the clarification. And then finally, funeral costs are addressed. And if you have the wherewithal and you want to do that for your family, that's one of those other gifts you can give them. Funerals can cost a lot. There are more affordable ways to do it, but they can cost a lot. And if you have it within your means to make those arrangements now and avoid the inflationary pressures that will raise those costs later, and save your family the need to come up with the cash when it may be hard because it will take a while for the estate to get settled, for the insurance payments to come in and all the rest. If you can do that now, that's a gift you can give to those who leave behind. That's from the funeral home industry, and that's the kinds of things I think in principle that you would deal with them.
The only thing I'd say about that is that my ex-father-in-law and mother-in-law made provisions that no matter where they died, their bodies would be brought back to Kansas City. And, that was a cost that we didn't have to do, which was really a blessing. So, yeah, and they paid for it up front, and of course, like 25 years prior to their death. So the cost of transporting the body back was a lot more than what they paid for.
I think things have changed in that regard, though, because when I was doing my arrangements, I had gone in and gotten the cost, what it would cost to transport my body up to the hospital, the research hospital in Portland. And by the time I decided to actually make all of this in stones, so to speak, the cost had gone up over $700 for the trip up there. And they said they don't guarantee that will cover all of the cost in the future if the prices go up.
Okay, so read the fine print when you make the arrangements with the funeral. I know when my mom died a few years ago now, she had actually done this sort of thing. And we talked back and forth about coming up with the extra cost because of inflation and all the rest. And we learned from the funeral home that no, in fact, she had paid for a guaranteed cost. And so, in fact, even though the prices have gone up, we got a couple $100 back. So, because we didn't do quite everything that she had imagined we might have to do. So, anyhow, I leave it at that. The same kinds of things generally apply to the church, with the exception mostly of the costs. And I just want to say it up front, and I'll say it again later, we do not do fee-for-service kinds of arrangements. A funeral doesn't cost you $200. Funeral with a mass costs $350. That is not what we do. There are a couple of exceptions. I'll come back to that in a bit, but by and large, it doesn't cost you anything to have a funeral at the church. In fact, if that's all you want, it's just a funeral, it doesn't cost you anything. If you want music, I have to talk to you and so on and so forth, but the service doesn't cost you anything.
I'm not going to be here.
What?
I'm not going to be here.
I know. Now that said, if your family wants to give us a gift, that's great. I never turn down gifts, and families typically do make a gift to the church church, but it's not an expectation, and it certainly isn't something you may or may not choose to do. I encourage you to do it. There's a bottom of the back page, there's a place for you to initial to say to your family, you don't have to do anything I say here.
Yeah, that's very good.
That's, you can put all those things down, but in my estimation, again, it's best if it's a gift, not a promise you exactly beyond the grave.
I left my body to the dog, so if you want to say goodbye, you have to put your hiking boots on and go out with Mr. Perez.
Tailored to what we do and or offer here at Trinity. So it isn't a generic book about how funerals are generally done. Because in my book, there were a couple places where I had to say, talk to your priest, talk to your priest. But here I can tell you, this is what we do. Okay. So there's that piece. First of all, that's the first advantage of this booklet over the book that I wrote once upon a time. The other advantage is it's free. Don't have to pay Amazon or anybody. Yes, sir.
In this sheet we just passed out, this is ours. Do we send it to the church? Do you have a file there?
That's a question we haven't yet answered. It's yours to fill out. I think before we get further down the road too far, we aren't there yet. I think we're going to invite you to, and if you want to do it now, you can. We'll figure out where to put it later. But give a copy to the church. Have a copy at home. Give a copy to some family member. All of those are good options.
And you may remember, she was very detailed in what she wanted. Said she passed it on to the church. Passed it to me, of course. I lost it immediately.
Which is why it's a good idea to make more than one copy.
The question comes up.
Yeah.
I started reading her Bible and found a lot of things in it that I was actually interested in seeing. I come from on 120th Psalm, and she says, I want this read at my funeral. Please! Exclamation point. Now, my question is, could I talk to Father Ted and say, could this be read at a service, that a psalm could be read, and indicating that this is a request?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'll come back to the readings here in a couple minutes. Absolutely, though. Short answer, yes. Footnote in the prayer book. This is actually, I don't know why they made it a footnote. It seems like they should have said this front and center. The liturgy for the dead is an Easter liturgy. You're going to do a tea party? Easter Sunday morning is the first tea party. Easter liturgy, it finds all its meaning in the resurrection. Because Jesus was raised from the dead, we too shall be raised. The liturgy, therefore, is characterized by joy in the certainty that, and this quote's from one of the Romans passages that are often read at funerals, neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. From Romans, chapter 8. And then it adds this important postscript, or this final part of the footnote. This joy, however, does not make your grief unchristian or wrong. Again, this is one of those things that family members sometimes do. I want it to be a celebration. I want it to be filled with joy and laughter. I don't want any crying. Well, that's just not fair. It is joy-filled, and at the heart of it, it is. But it doesn't make grief unchristian. The very love we have for each other in Christ brings deep sorrow when we are parted by death. Jesus himself wept at the grave of his friend. So while we rejoice that one we love has entered into the nearer presence of our Lord, we sorrow and sympathy with those who mourn. All right, the booklet. You get the first one, my handout. Here, you just say about it, there's two things. There's the booklet itself, which covers a host of the kinds of questions and options and all that we have to wrestle with for planning a service. The 150 decisions, there are a lot of them right here in this booklet. The other thing it has is a worksheet, and it's a different worksheet than the one I gave out already. This is the one I would normally work on with a family when we're actually planning a service. So it's all well and good to have the other one, but I got to pull these things together for this particular service at this particular time. And that other worksheet, actually, if you notice, it has other things that this doesn't have. I don't care about your Social Security number for this. The reason the other sheet has Social Security number on it because your family members may not know what your Social Security number is. helpful for it to be written down somewhere. So if you have it and you make 5 copies and the church has one and your children have 2 or 3 of them and you have one in an obvious place at home, it'll make it that much easier to find some of those things that they may need to go. And there's some other things like that that don't pertain to the funeral, but may pertain to your needs then. Yes, ma'am.
At one point I see missing, and maybe just because I was on the committee for it, nowhere on here do we indicate early night walk memorials.
No, it doesn't say that there, and that again might, I only allow room for a little bit of space, but that's a good point. I mean, we could rework the worksheet, you could do an addendum, you could staple it to it, and yeah.
Jed?
Yes.
I was talking to my brother who's retired from the military, and he said one thing said, when you go to this class, make sure they mention that if you were in the military and you want to have a military funeral, make sure you have on one of these sheets where what they call your DD 214 is located, because you can't be buried at a national cemetery unless you can produce a copy of the DD 214 and give them. And we found out with my father, we found every other military record he had except that one, but we were able to do it. So on the list somewhere, if you're retired, if you're ex-military and you want to be buried at a national cemetery, make sure you tell people where your DD 214 is.
Was that discharge papers?
Yeah.
And there's also a small cash distribution for
Right.
veterans.
Yeah.
And those are the kinds of things that a funeral home really has. I mean, funeral homes get a bad rap, and sometimes they've deserved it over the years. But usually they really are public services, and they usually serve us well. And that's the kind of thing they can be very helpful on. Okay. You'll note on the inside of that one of the first things I reprinted was that footnote to introduce the whole of the service. I don't have a copy of the book in front of me anymore. I kind of remember how it's laid out. So what kind of, and Kate, this is your question, what kind of service is that? Is it a worship service, or is it a celebration of life? Now, I've already told you, I think, why or what the difference is, to some extent. This is the sort of question we didn't used to ask when I first started out in ordained ministry. If somebody came to the priest for a service, we knew what they were looking for. They were looking for the burial of the dead, right 1, right 2. And it was really pretty straightforward, cut and dry. But now I think we have to ask this kind of question because we're used to a lot of changes, especially in a place like Oregon. I learned that 10 and a half years ago when I moved here from Illinois. When I was in Illinois, in the suburbs outside of Chicago, we knew how to do a funeral. We knew exactly what was going to happen, and we had a pretty good idea when it would happen. If I got a call from somebody that their loved one died Tuesday night, I was almost certain they're going to do the funeral on Friday. Because it was just a routine we did. And we had a way of doing things. And I never had to wonder too much about that. And I knew what they expected in terms of the church and all the rest. So generally, I mean, obviously there's some fine-tuning and some tweaks, but generally that's true. But that isn't so true anymore. And that celebration of life phrase isn't one I don't think we use, at least in the church, very often until fairly recently when it started coming up. And it comes up, I think, primarily in retirement communities. And I think in a retirement community, I think, Peter, maybe we were talking about this with your mom. If you go back to Anna Maria to do a service for her there around the time of her burial, Anna Maria will not let you do a funeral, a memorial, probably. They're probably going to say, we'll do a celebration of life. And I think we can understand that.
You should clarify what Anna Maria is.
Anna Maria is a retirement community in Medford where Marty Duell lived for a number of years before she came to live at Touchmark. And I suspect Touchmark's the same way. I suspect Touchmark, if you do a celebration up there after someone dies, they'll want to say it's a celebration of life. It's not a memorial. And I understand that. I do understand the sensibility there. But from our perspective, we kind of want to name the reality. Someone hasn't passed. They've died. They're dead. And that cuts hard. But I think it's an honesty that is helpful for us to name. But anyhow, celebration of life is how a lot of people want to do it. And I don't really fundamentally disagree with what they're trying to get at. But at a service here, while we will celebrate a life, here's the thing that goes with it. Sometimes I'll say, a life well lived is worth honoring. And that's true, but that isn't fundamentally what we do in a funeral or a memorial or the burial of the dead. It's not wrong, but it isn't the point of our worship, because our focus has shifted subtly but significantly away from the accomplishments of life to the reasons we have any hope after we die. Because it isn't what you've done in this life that offers you hope in the end. Neither on the negative side nor on the positive side is the love of God. And that's what we want to insist on when we do a church service. And there's a couple of ways that comes out, and I'm going to maybe hit on it a little bit. The other question is where to have it. And that'll make a difference too. If you do it in the church, I got to tell you, it's going to be a church service. It's just it. If you do it somewhere else, you're going to have greater latitude. Funeral versus memorial. In Oregon, in particular, and the distinction, if there is any distinction between them, is a funeral. There are the remains there somehow. The urn is there, or the casket is there. And in Oregon, in the 10 and a half years I've been here, it's uncommon for the remains to be there. In Illinois, it was pretty much expected. Not always, but generally. And so that's the distinction people make. Again, as far as the service goes, it makes no difference, because neither one is actually a prayer book service. Burial of the dead is the prayer book service. But that's the distinction that people will often make. Urns are uncommon. Caskets almost unheard of. When we did a service for Don Halligan in early February, family had a casket here. They wanted the casket here, and several of us got pretty anxious about whether we knew where the pall was. Because if you do a funeral, you're going to have a casket with a pall on it, like this, of some sort. Thankfully, Helen knew right where it was, so it was a short-lived anxiety. But it was an anxiety for a moment. The pall, the significance of that, and there's a smaller one if there's an urn. The pall, the significance of that is, and this goes back to the other point I made, the hope we have isn't how good we've been, how rich we've been. You know, I sometimes, if that's a cardboard box on it, it looks the same to God, as if it's a gold-plated casket. It looks the same to God. We cover over the distinctions at a service like that. That's, again, one of the differences between the celebration of life and the burial office, is we cover over the distinctions between persons. And by the way, if you have an urn, I remind you, we have a columbarium here. And we I don't think, have talked it up all that much for a while, since before I got here, for lots of reasons, I'm sure, lots of really good reasons. But it's probably time to remind you, we have a columbarium. Once upon a time, when you were buried, you were taken to the church, and then you were taken outside into the churchyard, and you were buried. And it's a continuation of that kind of understanding, that we sometimes talk about the church being the place that carries us from womb to tomb. Are the full of our life, from the moment we're born till after we die, all within the arms of the church. And the columbarium is that same idea. So that's our columbarium here. And when? Did I already say that? I didn't say that. No, and when? That's the other regional difference that I've experienced in Oregon. Again, from the Midwest. In the Midwest, we knew exactly when the service was going to happen based on when the person died. Not so here. Very common for it to be, most common for it to be at least a couple of weeks. It's pretty unusual locally for us to try and turn it around in a couple of days. When should you do it? Well, that's a judgment call. In my estimation, generally, as soon as you can. Not that it gets you through the grief you need to do, but it's one less burden for you to carry as you're trying to get through the grief. So in my estimation, my encouragement is when I have a chance to weigh in on that, is how soon can you do it? The question really has to be, like at a wedding, actually, in some ways, who needs to be there? And so, we've got to be a little flexible, and I appreciate that about the Oregon, sort of we don't care what you say we have to do kind of attitude. We do it when we need to do it, and who needs to be at that service needs to drive the decision. But I do kind of resent the attitude sometimes, because what I often hear from people is, well, family's going to be here for Memorial Day weekend. Father, can you come and do the service then? It's like, I'd like a holiday too. I think I'm generally accommodating.
Christmas time.
Yes. Family will be here for Christmas. Easter. Easter.
The day after Easter.
Holy Week. It's spring break. Can you do the service during Holy Week? Well, I try to be accommodating, and I try to be gracious to people when they ask, but I got to tell you, something inside of me goes, really, could we maybe do it at a time that was more helpful, a little easier, but it's what it is. Thanksgiving weekend, not in my estimation, a great weekend to do a funeral. And then there's these other questions, Eucharist or not, rite one versus rite two, again, those are sometimes thorny questions. People will often ask, we're going to have a lot of people there. They're not all Episcopalians. I don't think we should do communion. A lot of Roman Catholics, a lot of Baptists, some Jewish people, some people that don't go to church, all the rest. I don't think we should do communion. And I understand that sensibility, but I got to tell you, there's hardly a time when it's not appropriate. And I usually take great care to invite people to participate to the extent they can. And they generally, in my experience, understand that. One of my worst examples, one of the worst stories I ever had about this was, do you remember, turn it back on, Kim, thank you, was Bishop Charlie Bergreen. Did you ever meet Charlie? Was he there when he was there after you, Dave? Was a member of the church in Medford. Charlie Bergreen was once upon a time Bishop of Armed Forces for the Episcopal Church. Great guy. He was dying by the time I got there, so I got to, watch him die. And when we had the service, there was sentiment raised that because there'd be so many people, he was so loved in the community. He was up at the Rogue Valley Manor, up on the hill, the big retirement community in Medford. And a lot of people from the Manor were going to be there for the service. Don't think we should have communion. And there was a priest outside the parish weighing in unhelpfully on this, and it really annoyed the heck out of me. And I said, really? A bishop of the church dies and you don't think we should have communion? You don't think people will understand? We had communion, but it was a harder decision than it should have been. We can work through that with family. We can work through that with friends. We can tell people you're invited. We can tell them why we're doing it, and we can tell them, participate to the extent we can. Now, there may be times you don't want to do that, and I get that, and that's fine. That's a decision we can always make. Rite one versus rite two. Who's going to be there? How are they best served? If it's a congregation of people who have always known the 28 prayer book and or the rite one service, and that's what they always do, that makes sense. And I do rite one funerals a lot, and that's fine. But rite two might be better depending on who's going to be there. If they're not church, if they don't understand such things, the language might be a little off-putting. Just think about it. I don't really care on that one, probably less than I care about anything else I've talked about so far. I don't care, but just, it's one of those things to think about. The readings. In the book, the last half of the book, really, is a reprint of the readings. And I reprint it for a couple of reasons. Mostly, I reprint it so that as you or as family members look at it, you can have it all in one place. And when you get to a thing like Psalm 100 or 120, I don't have the Psalms in this book, but I have all the other readings. You can circle the phrase, the idea you have in mind, and you can write in the margin, I want this at my funeral.
Please.
So that can be helpful. That's the list of recommended readings. But there are occasions when you might want to do something else. This is, that famous reading from Ecclesiastes is one that I've read at a few funerals over the years. For everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to live and a time to die. You know, and for some people, that's a really helpful verse to have at that time. We did this 1 Corinthians 13 thing a couple weeks ago. It's about love. It's a love chapter. You do it at weddings. It might be appropriate. I've done this at least 1 or 2 funerals. It might be appropriate in that context too, especially when you get to the end, if you remember. For now we see through the mirror dimly. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I am fully known. That's a lovely reading for a funeral. It's not on our list, but we can go outside the list if you talk to your priest. And then this morning's, and I told the story in my sermon this morning earlier, and I'll tell it again. The prodigal son. It might be a really, and I have used it, I think, helpfully at a funeral. The story of the prodigal son and the father that welcomes the prodigal in. Not on our list. Gospel readings are all from John, but this one from Luke is a pretty good one. All right, sermons versus homilies. First part, there is no technical difference between a sermon and a homily. I know some of you think, I want a homily, they're shorter. I know. Technically, there is no difference between a sermon and a homily. They're the same name, different names. Eulogies are different. And technically, by our way of thinking of things, eulogies aren't appropriate at a funeral. Because it isn't about them, it's about the hope we have for them. Now, I try to personalize it. I try to have a connection that reminds us of who it is. It is a particular person at the end of the day that we are burying. But the hope we have for them, eulogy, good words, it isn't about the good words we can say about them. It's about the good hope we have for them. That's a subtle distinction. Now, we typically allow I make room for remembrances and the like at a service like this, but I don't let that be the last word. I always get the last word in, and I don't refute what the family may have said in their good words about them, even as I add to that. So it's music, same thing. We don't do that rock and roll. Not generally. I do have something to say about that. There's another story. At our local funeral parlor, families are given the chance to choose the music CD they would like to have played. One family asked to enter to Elvis Presley's hit, Love Me Tender. It seemed appropriate for the funeral. Well, the day of the funeral arrived, the music was started, ready for the family to walk into the service. Unfortunately, the wrong track number was entered into the CD player, and the family found themselves walking into Return to Sender. Such numbers.
Return to Cinder.
Okay, so now I've made allowances. Charlie Berggren, I mentioned him before, the Episcopal Armed Forces. Back in the day when the Music Man first came out, he and his wife went to the theater to see the Music Man, and Charlie announced he wanted to have played at his funeral 76 trombones. And our organist figured out how to play a rendition of 76 trombones as the postlude that day. Postludes and preludes around the edges. We did Over the Rainbow not long ago for Jerry Reynolds, you recall. Especially at the beginning and end, I think it's okay. The heart of the service is still a Christian service, though. So the music there comes right in. The back of your book, you have second to last, the inside of the back cover, some suggested hymns. I really have been reluctant to write that down. I've in earlier versions of this kind of a book, but I haven't included hymn suggestions because I think it's too limiting. If it's helpful, know that you have these that you can look at. But be aware of other possibilities. I have some points to make. Be aware of the context of the service. It might be a lovely bit of verse, but if people can't sing it, it doesn't help much. And especially if you're talking about a service with people from various traditions, we probably are best served staying with some real good, familiar ones. If it's going to be a service with a lot of Episcopalians there, we can pick some Episcopal favorites. If it's going to be a mixed congregation, it might be some of the hymns that we like in our church don't necessarily get as much play in other churches. So just be aware of that. Receptions, we have plans for that, let us know. Jeannie will help us figure it out.
For now.
We have,
Until I pass
we
it
have
along to
reception
somebody else.
teams, and that process is a little bit in flux now, as it usually is. But, you know, we'll figure that out.
We'll figure it out.
We'll figure that out. Charges and fees, again, we don't charge. That said, typically, we have to charge for the organist. If you're gonna have music, which, by the way, you don't have to have. And again, it depends on the service and the context and all the rest. But if you're gonna have music, I have to pay the organist, and I typically ask the parent and the family to pay it. That said, if even that's a problem, let me know. We'll get it covered. We will get it covered, I assure you. The other charge to be aware of here is if you're going to be in the columbarium, there is a charge for that. Again, we can talk to you about that. And it's best if you can do it, to do it for your family before you die. It's just a nice gift you can do. So, but you don't have to. That's something else. Okay, next week, John Collins is going to be here. He's going to talk about a holy death. So, come back next week. Thank you all.